you. Thank you for everyone being here. I appreciate Florida Coastal and NADA in particular for inviting me today. This has been a great symposium already. I really enjoyed the discussion that you had, Dr. Jervis. And it's a great segue actually to my discussion today, where I'm going to kind of focus on what I call the chemistry between patent and regulatory exclusivity for pharmaceuticals, or that bad word, drugs. And these are small molecules, but for me it's really important because I like to feel that I'm kind of giving back to the community, and I think one of the issues that you just brought up was the Supreme Court was really dealing with the issue of the expense of drugs and some therapeutic products that are available. And so to that end, we'll talk a little bit about this, because this really has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, there may be patent protection for a particular product, but in my industry, in pharmaceuticals and therapeutics and biologics, there is a lot of expense involved with that, and sometimes patents just aren't enough. So because you can find a lot of issues with them. So some interesting statistics that I found. When you look at, again, the industry, only about 1 in 10 drugs that ever actually even make it into clinical trials, so into humans, actually are ever approved. And when you look at the numbers, actually only about 1 in 5 to 10,000 even make it to clinical trials. So you're talking about a very, very small subset that ever actually get to market. And when you look at that time period involved from discovery to approval, it's a 12 to 15-year process involving, when they look at the numbers, actually $1.3 billion to develop and approve one single product. And if you adjust for all the failures that they have, which there are plenty of failures, because maybe it's not safe, it's not as effective as another drug out there, you can actually look at the numbers, and they suggest it's somewhere more like $4 billion for every drug that actually, again, makes it to the market. So with those numbers, you kind of have to ask yourself, if we have that cost involved in developing a drug, how am I going to ever recoup that? How am I going to make a profit? How am I going to have a business that can actually, be profitable and continue developing new drugs? So that's when you have to start looking at what kind of exclusivity do I have around this particular product, and how can I expand that? And so today we're going to hit a couple of topics, just go through a little bit of the FDA approval process for branded and generic drugs. Also look at a special topic, the Orange Book, which I know a lot of people say, what is the Orange Book? Is it really orange? Yes, it's really orange. And then take a look at those regulatory or marketing exclusivities that are provided by statute that are separate from the exclusivity provided by a patent, but actually work together, and there's that chemistry. And then we'll do a little bit, if we have time, a case study on a particular drug called Ampyra that I worked on that's a treatment for multiple sclerosis. So the FDA approval process, based on a statute called the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which at the end of the day, if you want to market a drug for therapeutic purposes, for treating a disease, you have to have that approved by the FDA, and it needs to meet certain safety and efficacy standards. In order to demonstrate that you've met those standards, you have to go through a very long process. It's somewhere between 8 to 12 years, but you're going through a number of clinical trials. They start out in healthy volunteers, and then they move on to folks who actually have the disease that you're investigating. So an example, and we'll kind of use this throughout, is, I'm sure you all have heard of Prilosec. It's now available over the counter. But Prilosec is used to treat heartburn. So if you were when they were developing Prilosec, they were looking at first testing it in healthy volunteers, people who don't have who do not have the condition, And then they go on and they test it in those who do have heartburn to make sure that it is in fact not only safe, but that it has efficacy. And then finally, they submit their application to the FDA, and then the FDA makes their decision as to whether or not they will approve that product. And you can only actually market, once you do have an approval, you can only market it for that particular indication. So again, if we're looking at Prilosec, you can only market it for heartburn. So what is a generic then? All of you go to the pharmacy probably and they ask you, do you want the brand or do you want the generic? Or what does your insurance cover, brand or generic? And most of the time, for most of us, and it makes sense, you want you will often be told by your healthcare provider that you need to have the generic, which is the less expensive version of the product. And the generic is a product that contains the same active ingredient as that innovator drug. It has the same dosage form, so if it's a capsule, you have a capsule. If it's administered orally, this one's oral, same strength, all of those, quality and use, it is all supposed to be the same. There are a few little things that can be different. You can have a few differences in some inactive ingredients, but for the most part, everything is the same. Now before we had some, we had some changes to the FDCA. Everyone who was trying to seek to get approval of a generic had to go through the entire approval process. So they had to go through phase 1 through phase 3. 8 to 10 year process when it's already been done before for the same exact drug, same form, all of that. So, and in addition, preclinical and clinical development activities were considered to be an infringement of a patent. So if I am the owner, the patentee for Prilosec, and I have my patent on the drug, on that composition of matter, that small molecule, and then there's somebody who wants to make a generic version of that. If they wanted to actually start testing it and doing all those clinical trials, the first time they enter into a clinical trial, that was considered to be infringement. And what happened was you ended up with this de facto extension of the brand's patent life. Because if the patent would end and let's say it expires in 2020, so it expires in 2020, well the generic couldn't even start until 2020 plus day 1. Well then there'd be another 8 years. So then they got 28 years. And I already said, whoa, this is not okay. So that's when basically Congress stepped in and they wanted to essentially create a statute where they would balance basically encouragement of the entry of generic products because they do have benefit. They provide a lower cost with the same efficacy and safety, but encourage the entry of generics, but also foster and encourage new drug development and innovation. So needed to kind of find that balance between the two. And that's when we got the Hatch-Waxman Act. Which is by Senators Hatch and Waxman. So it's been an extremely significant act from the start. Before we had this act and kind of this dance between the innovators and the generics, we only had maybe less than, I think it was 20% of prescriptions were ever filled with a generic product. Now, today, and this was passed in 1984, today about 80% of prescriptions are actually filled with the generic. So it has, the statistics don't actually show that it's necessarily decreased healthcare costs overall. It's kind of interesting when you look at the math. You will actually see a rise in the cost for the innovator drug, so that first drug that comes out. That one will actually be priced higher because they recognize now that there is more entry of a generic and oftentimes sooner. So it's kind of made an interesting case where you see higher prices initially, but then you see a very, very big drop in the end. So going through what the standard application process is for a new drug. So again, any drug that you want to bring on the market and sell for a disease, you have to provide them with all of this information in this drug application, including your chemistry, your clinical data, your toxicology, and then you also have to identify all of the patents that actually cover that particular drug. So whether it's the composition of matter, a method of using it, well, those are the two main areas. You have to actually tell that to the FDA, and that's what we call these Orange Book listable patents. And these patents, ultimately, when that product is approved, those patents are listed in a book, that is orange, and it tells you all of the patents that cover that particular product. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get into a little bit later. And there are regulations that define exactly what kind of patents are eligible to be listed in that orange book. But again, it's essentially that drug, so that composition of matter, the active ingredient, the particular formulation, if it's in a pill or a capsule, it might have some excipients in there that help with release, things like that. But it's not things like the packaging, or maybe there's an intermediate in the synthesis of that particular active ingredient. Those are not listable. But this is a very important concept in the dance between the innovator and the generic. So some examples, some particular examples, and this is where being a patent attorney, when you have somebody coming to you with a new drug, what are the things that you're going to look for? What can I claim? How can I claim them? And it actually shows the importance of, when somebody comes to you with an invention, really exploring, what is this invention? How can I use it? How are the different ways that I can claim, essentially, the same thing? What basically distinguishable elements can I add to claims that really provide a difference between those claims? And you actually want to claim all of those, because oftentimes you'll find that maybe one of your broader claims may not be found to be valid, but maybe one of the narrow ones still is, and it still covers your product. So important in this field as well. So here, these again are some examples actually for Prilosec. You have a composition comprising a therapeutically effective amount of esomeprazole, which is the active ingredient, a method of inhibiting gastric acid secretion, that's treating heartburn, also the composition comprising the magnesium salt. So those are examples. One product, but here you have, I mean, this is just the start, 4 different types of claims that you could present, and that would be listable in the Orange Book. And these types of things come out of not only when you first discover and develop that drug, where you look at the compounds, the main uses, the formulation that you put it into, but then at the clinical stage, when you're using it in humans, you start to figure out, is there a new dosage that I need, a new formulation that I need, because maybe I need to make sure that I release it a little bit later, so I need to change the pH of my formulation, or I might need to combine it with another drug because there's a side effect that I need to treat or prevent. And then as well, at post-approval, and this is where they talk about, you'll hear this a lot in the news, life cycle management, where the branded drug or the innovator is seeking ways to extend life on that particular drug, because again, that's where they're, in the end, we are a business. You're making your profit so that you can in turn, discover new drugs going forward. So how does a generic get approved? There are 2 ways, but essentially what they are is called an ANDA, is a short form, abbreviated new drug application. They get very creative. And with an ANDA, all that the generic needs to do is basically demonstrate that they are what is called bioequivalent. So essentially when you put that drug into a human, it's going to act exactly the same way as the innovator drug does. And they otherwise show that they're the same dosage form, same strength, all of those samenesses. So that way, the FDA can then rely on the innovator drug's clinical trials to demonstrate that that will be safe and effective. So it makes it so that the generic doesn't have to do all of those clinical trials that takes the 8 to 10 years that it normally takes. Now when they file that application, this is when you actually have to, the ANDA or generic needs to actually certify with respect to, it's called certify, with respect to each patent that is listed in the Orange Book. And they can make a couple of different certifications. Sometimes it's to say, look, there's nothing listed in the Orange Book. I looked up Prilosec, there's no patents listed under Prilosec. So I'm free to get my approval right now. Or there might be, and the key one is a paragraph 4 certification, which is where there are patents listed in the Orange Book, they're still valid, they're still in force, and you have to make a statement that you're asserting that those patents are invalid or I won't infringe them, which is a little bit difficult to do when you are an exact copy, but it's possible. So one of the things that Hatch-Waxman did was make the actual act of filing a paragraph 4 certification an act of infringement. So statutorily they created that to be an act of infringement, because normally you actually have to be out and offer your product for sale. You have to be marketing. Well here, just filing an application to seek approval of a generic drug is an act of infringement if you say that I don't infringe Prilosec's patent. And with that comes this relatively complicated process, but at the end of the day, what happens is there's an incentive for the generics to do this, and they built this into these changes. There's an incentive because if the generic does make this paragraph 4 certification, and they litigate, and the generic wins and can get on the market, then the generic will actually receive 180 days of market exclusivity themselves. So that is a big incentive because, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, expensive for the innovator drug is typically expensive. Generic entry really pushes those prices down. But in the middle, when you have those first generics coming into the market, they're actually priced a little bit higher to, again, recoup their costs. Now, a generic drug doesn't cost that, or is not as expensive to develop because all they have to do is bioequivalency studies. But still, there's costs involved. They need to make money, so there's their incentive. So with that paragraph 4 certification, if the patentee commences this infringement suit within 45 days of receipt of that paragraph 4 cert, then the FDA actually stays the approval of that ANDA for 30 months, so that's 2.5 years, unless the court makes a decision. So essentially what's going on is the generic files their paragraph 4 certification, says I want to seek approval of my generic Prilosec. They submit it to the FDA and then they have to tell Prilosec, hey, I'm going to make a generic copy of you. Do you mind? And they usually say, yes, I mind a lot. Here are all of my patents that I have. You've said that all of them are invalid and not infringed. Baloney. We're going to court. So they go to court, and at that moment, though, the FDA says, I'm not going to touch this. I'm not going to look at the application. I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to wait and see what the courts say as far as whether or not those patents are invalid or not infringed. Because if they are, then I can't approve that drug, because if I do, they would be infringing. But if they aren't, then I can approve the drug. And sometimes there's this automatic 30-month stay. So that is a very valuable tool for the innovator drug. And like I said, we talked about why does the ANDA want to be one of the first ones into the door. That's because they get 180-day exclusivity. So they're able to kind of price their product a little bit higher for those 6 months or so. So what other exclusivities are available? Because we're kind of talking about patents that are available if you've discovered a new drug or a new way of using it. You can apply for patents and issue claims on the drug itself and how to use it. But what else is available? Because sometimes that may not be enough. And in fact, I think what Congress has recognized, what we have recognized is there also needs to be some certainty, because sometimes with patents, they aren't so certain. And so they want to make sure that there is actually a set period of time where the innovator is rewarded for the work that they have done, spending that $1.3 billion, essentially. So there are a couple of types of exclusivity that are provided for by statute, and really they have to do with the actual drug itself. So if one of the first ones, and the most important one, is what's called NCE exclusivity, or New Chemical Entity exclusivity. What that is if somebody comes forward with a new molecule that has never been approved before in the US. When you come to the FDA with a brand new molecule, then they will essentially give you a 5-year period of exclusivity where they will not approve that same molecule for 5 years. Now after that 5 years, they will approve it unless, and this is where we get into kind of that interplay, there are patents there that are listed in the Orange Book, and then that litigation dance kind of starts. So you do have a 5-year period of exclusivity if you are a brand new, what they call active moiety. And the ANDA cannot be approved for those five years. Now every once in a while you see a generic coming through, and they may want to actually file an NDA, but in order to do that they've had to have done all of their clinical trials. So that doesn't happen very often. There's also a shorter exclusivity that's available called clinical investigation exclusivity. And that's where you have the same molecule. It's already been approved by the FDA, but now you've figured out maybe a new use for that drug. So instead of Prilosec and the fact that it can treat heartburn, they now discovered that Prilosec treats baldness. That's my favorite example because it's pretty simple. So you figured out that Prilosec, if you rub it on your head, treats baldness. So if somebody comes to the FDA and they've done all of their clinical work and they say, I can now treat baldness with this same drug, they will actually be given a 3-year period of exclusivity. So not as long, only 3 years. And during that time, the FDA is actually allowed to review other generic applications for that same drug, but they cannot approve it for those 3 years. And then we also have orphan drug exclusivity, and this one is actually extremely important and has been one of the most successful exclusivities around. Orphan drug exclusivity is essentially for those drugs that are intended to treat what's called orphan diseases. And they named them orphan diseases because they were diseases that most of the time, quite honestly, Big Pharma would not look at because they had small populations of patients, and they looked at that and said, you know, these probably aren't going to be able to, we're not going to recoup our R&D costs, so we don't really have an incentive to make or discover treatments for these diseases. So what they did with Hatch-Waxman is come out and say, look, if you give us a drug for one of these orphan diseases, something that just isn't very common, we will give you 7 years of exclusivity. And also, all of your costs, your filing fees for your application process with the FDA are reduced in half. And if you think about it, one example, an NDA filing fee is about $1 million right off the bat, just to file the application. So theirs is reduced to $500,000. So a nice perk as well, a nice incentive. In addition, they get kind of a fast track approval. So the FDA works quickly to get those things approved. A lot of cancer indications fall under this category. Some things with MS. There are a lot of examples. So this has been extremely successful, and we've actually seen an increase of over, I think, over 40% of drugs in the orphan space. So I think that's been a very positive outcome. And then very recently, they've also, because lately you've seen in the news a lot of concern about antibiotics becoming basically ineffective because the bacteria are getting resistant and the virus is getting resistant to our antivirals and antibacterials. And so one of the things that was recently done in the last 2 years was a new exclusivity, which they call QIPID, and it extends those 5, 3, and 7 year periods. They extend those an additional 5. So if you were a brand new molecule and you should have gotten 5 years, well, if you're a brand new molecule and you actually treat one of these resistant infections, you'll actually get 10 years. So that's been also a good thing that they have done recently. And then another area that they've added on to is the patent term extension. So everybody here probably knows that your patent is running from the date that you file that non-provisional, 20 years. That's all you get. Well, I think you all saw in the beginning that the approval process from discovery to market can take 12 to 15 years. Well, if that's the case, you could be left with what? I'm not great at math, but 8 to 5 years left of patent life. That's not a lot, and not a lot of incentive. So patent term extension is, again, a statutorily created right that has been given where you can extend the life of a patent up to 5 years. And there are a lot of, and you can kind of see a lot of requirements and limitations to it. But ultimately, it extends the patent for a particular drug an additional up to 5 years. And it's supposed to be equivalent to the time that it took you to develop that drug while your patent was already issued. And it's not automatic. You have to go through a long approval process and review period, but you get some of that time back if your patent issued, but you still weren't on the market. So another plus. So those are essentially some of the exclusivities, and I know I'm standing between you and lunchtime, so I will try and go through this very quickly. But I did want to give you kind of a real-world example of how this works, and again, why I feel that it's important, because ultimately you need to feel, I think you need to feel personally invested in what you're doing, and you need to really enjoy it. And for me, it comes out of examples like this. So Ampyra is an approved product now out on the market. It's been approved for the treatment of MS and particularly improving walking speed in patients with MS. And there's never been a drug out there available until this point in time. And our client was Accorda Therapeutics. Sorry, that Nada had the pleasure of working on as well, so they were interesting. But Accorda basically discovered that this drug would be useful in improving walking speed for MS patients. But this drug was a known compound. It had been out in the art for years. It actually had been used for other uses, not therapeutic uses. So this was a new use that they had discovered. And they ultimately went through the process, and it was a long, long process. They had failed phase 2 clinical trials that they had to redo. So it probably took them, I think, over almost 15 years from the point where they decided that they were going to focus on this drug to the point of getting approval in 2010. So they were steadfast in their pursuit of this drug and getting this approved because they really did truly believe in it. So they got approval in 2010, and because this was a drug that had never been approved before, they got the NCE exclusivity, so 5 years. In addition, because it's an orphan drug, they also got 7-year exclusivity that run concurrently. And because of some of the work that we had done. They also had 4 Orange Book listed patents, one of which actually got patent term extension. So this is, I copied this just so you guys kind of get an idea of what it looks like. It's nothing exciting, but this is what a little snippet of the Orange Book looks like when you open it up and you pull up Ampyra, and this is what it says. It tells you your 4 patents that cover it, gives you the expiry date, and then it also tells you at the bottom there the exclusivities that are associated with this. And the purpose of this is to inform the generics. If they want to come and market a generic version of Ampyra, this is what they need to deal with. They need to look and recognize that as a generic, I can't come and seek approval of my product until January 23rd, 2015. And actually, because it's orphan drug, if they're coming to them with the same exact indication, which they would be, it's actually more likely it'll be January 22nd, 2017. And then you also have 4 patents that are listed there, which they would have to file paragraph 4 certifications against. So if you look at this from a timeline perspective, this is where you see that chemistry kind of coming together. Because if there's any one part of this that is missing, then you may not have had the appropriate incentive for Accorda to spend 15 years working on this drug and getting it approved. Because while you have the NCE and the orphan drug exclusivity that gives them the 7 years, once that's over, you're sitting in 2017 and they had maybe 7 years of exclusivity. Well, if they only have 7 years to recoup their R&D costs, that's 15 years of cost they're looking at in 7 years. Guess how high that drug will be priced? Probably pretty high. Or they may have not done it at all in the first place. So then you also have the patents, but you don't want to have just the patents, because we all recognize the patents have weaknesses, that they might be invalidated. They might have limitations that a generic could come in, be identical, but maybe there's one little element in one of those claims that they don't infringe, and so they fall outside. So the patents aren't a perfect block either. So while they appear to last till 2025 and beyond, those might have some weaknesses in them as well. So you kind of have this layering of both the regulatory and the patent exclusivity that gives them really the appropriate incentive to, again, go forward with this, the development of the drug and seeking approval. And what was interesting, like I said on this one, it didn't have composition of matter, but it shows you the importance of what those exclusivities can give you from the regulatory perspective, as well as the exclusivity on the patent side. So if you look at Ampyra again specifically, here you would see that right now, at a minimum, they get 5 years exclusivity. But actually with that interplay of the patents and the regulatory exclusivity, they could actually enjoy 17 years of exclusivity. Now again, I know that the media oftentimes will put Big Pharma in bad light. Accorda is definitely not an example of Big Pharma. They're actually, when they started, they were a small startup up in New York, in White Plains of all places. But they really, have a cause that they're working to try and find therapeutics for some of these orphan diseases. So they really do provide important benefit to us. And so personally, I think that they should be rewarded for that work. So what's the take home? At the end of the day, you look at patents playing a critical role in the life cycle of a drug. Secondary patents that are kind of focused not on the composition of matter, but more on the methods of use, the formulations, they can be extremely important. And can provide that protection against generic entry. But But that patent exclusivity is really only as strong as the validity and then the scope, that breadth of that patent. So that's why regulatory exclusivity is extremely important, because that provides certainty, but it's a limited period of certainty. So while Hatch-Waxman was meant to strike a balance between innovation and generic entry, you do actually see a lot more successful generics entering a lot sooner. And like I said before, it kind of is causing this a little bit of a trend where the innovator will push their prices up actually early on in order to try and recoup their investment sooner. And so because of that, I really personally advocate for a lot more aggressive regulatory exclusivity terms beyond just the 3, 5, and 7 year terms. I would like to see something that is a little bit longer. In Europe and some other countries, they actually provide a 10-year period of exclusivity, which I think might actually be a win-win for everyone, because it still allows entry of generics, but at a little bit later date. With that, if anyone has any questions, or otherwise I know you guys are off to lunch, so. Yes?
Does the FDA approval, does it happen before or after clinical trials?
After. So you do all of your clinical trials, and then you file your application with the FDA, and then they approve it.
So once you get FDA approval, you're not losing any exclusivity to any kind of trial or testing?
Correct, but they can do, a generic can do all of their testing, or if there was just somebody else developing that drug, they can do all of their testing, because now it is exempted from infringement under 271E. 1, 2, something like that. So yeah, so people can be doing those trials, but you've already done them, got your approval, and then you market for that particular indication, and you don't have to continue doing any trials. Okay. All right, thank you.